everyone, and welcome back to Always Watching. For those of you new to my channel, I don't normally film from a park, but because I'm traveling, I have to film when and where I can. So for today's video, we are talking about Untold, the girlfriend who did not exist. It is a Netflix documentary chronicling the life of Manti Te'o, whose online relationship nearly ended his career. The documentary interviews Manti, Lennay, the person who catfished him, as well as Manti's family and close friends. So the documentary is in two parts. The first episode introduces us to Manti and Lennay. The second unpacks sort of the aftermath of this chaos. So briefly, I'm just going to introduce you to Manti and Lennay, and then we're going to talk about the insanity that was this documentary. So briefly, Manti grew up in Hawaii. His family was not wealthy, so the only way for him to kind of go to college was to excel in sports, and thankfully he did. He was an amazing football player, and he made his way to Notre Dame, and his decision to go to Notre Dame was not an easy one, right? He wasn't that enthusiastic or excited to go there. It was cold, there wasn't a lot of people like him, and I think the only upside about going to a college like that is that it's small. You know, there's not a lot of big personalities. You're not as stimulated as you would be in a place like, say, California. And I thought it was interesting that he forgoed his initial instincts to go to a different college. I think sometimes where you want to go is not where you're meant to go. And it's hard to know, if any of this would have happened had he not gone to Notre Dame. Would this have happened? Or maybe he would have been, destined for something far worse. And so at Notre Dame, he was described as the perfect student athlete, and his success on the field made him like a local celebrity. He was signing autographs. He basically just brought life back to this dying franchise, and people were like excited to support their team again. Drama began with a friend request from a young woman named Lennay, aka Lennay. Lennay is actually invited to speak in this documentary. Like, that's what made it crazy. You have the person who was catfished and the catfish speaking. Whether or not you find her to be a sympathetic character is really up to you. Personally, I did not find her to be sympathetic at all. And I got the sense that she felt like justified in the end. And I'm all for people finding themselves and discovering themselves, but not at the expense of someone else. And this incident quite literally paralyzed him. It paralyzed his life. And as he was speaking, you get the sense that this was not easy for him to talk about again. Whereas Lennay, I just felt like she was kicking it throughout the documentary, and we'll come back to that. So to begin, I say she because Lennay, now Naya, is identifying as transgender in the documentary. So just as a documentary is really interesting because they kind of let people speak without any real interference. And I'm not sure that worked very well. There's such a fine line between explaining yourself and then holding someone accountable, So it really is up to the audience to figure out, you'll leave this documentary with strong feelings. Naya, like Manti, grew up under the belief that life was quite literally faith, family, and football. Unlike Manti, she came from a lineage of NFL players, which I thought was super interesting. But sadly, Naya was like the black sheep of the family, and she had no interest in football. She kind of went through the motions, but she just didn't really care about it. In addition, because she was born male, she always felt like there was something not right, like she didn't feel home in her own body. And so this sort of alienation from herself is what caused her to go online and create this Lennay character. So Lennay, who's really Diana, who's really Lennay, is a classmate of Naya's. So she basically spotted this girl on campus. She thought she was cute. And so she kind of found her online profiles and just stole all her pictures and essentially created an identity around this picture, around this face. And, once this profile went live, she would get friend requests. She was chatting up guys. She was quite popular online, she was getting the hits that she wanted. However, once these guys wanted to meet, that's when she would kind of cut the conversation off and move on to the next. And so as Lennay's profile was getting traction, anyone who's watched Catfish knows one of the ways to make your profile look real is to have friends. So Naya created a whole family around the picture, including herself, to kind of make this Lennay feel as real as possible. When Manti accepted the request, he didn't think anything of it, because first, they came from a similar background, and second, they had mutual friends, right? He could confirm that a Lennay did exist. And the relationship started slow, but then as Lennay started sharing more and more of herself, you know, they started to really develop this deep emotional bond. And a lot of what Lennay was sharing were these kind of false tragedies that kind of played on his heartstrings, right? His father is sick, you know, and he's a very naive, you know, boy. So he felt it was his obligation to check in with her and, you know, be there for her and be the man. And, you know, it really tugged at his heartstrings. So as the relationship grew more intense, they would talk on the phone. Like, that was the crazy part. And everybody around Manti, like, they knew about this. They heard her voice. They didn't think anything sus of it. One of his friends in the documentary was like, yeah, she had a beautiful voice. So there was really nothing for them to suspect. So eventually they kind of created this routine of talking, praying, go to bed. Like, they became such an intricate part of each other's lives. And so red flags started popping up whenever Manti wanted to meet, right? Or wanted to FaceTime. And according to Naya, she kind of exhausted every excuse in the book. And again, if you've seen Catfish, you know the excuse. My phone is broken, bad connection, whatever, you know, like, and he kind of bought it. And so eventually Naya decided, okay, you know what, this is getting too far and I gotta kill this off. You know, I quite literally have to kill this off. The whole process of killing off Lennay, I mean, this was really elaborate. And this was at a time where people were not familiar with catfishing, right? So because Naya had created a whole family around this person, she would not only talk to Manti and his family as, you know, Lennay, but she would talk to him as the brother, the father, the mother. Like, there were just a lot of characters that she created through this one voice. And so at some point in the process of killing off Lennay, she created this whole elaborate story that she was in a car crash and she was dying of leukemia or just some drama. And poor Manti, right? Like, he was devastated. He's telling his family's devastated. And the effect that it had on him, again, it quite literally paralyzed this man. And from the beginning, his family was skeptical, especially his dad, right? His dad did ask him, like, did you meet her? And he lied. He said yes. And this didn't really help the situation. And so, again, a part of the reason why they didn't really suspect is because Lennay came from a similar family background. And they were able to confirm that a Lennay did exist, right? So as Manti's father was explaining, a lot of these red flags were kind of put to the side because of that. Throughout the documentary, that's what Manti kept saying. He kept saying, okay, that's what I held on to, that I verified her identity. But during this time, you would not think to verify a name and a face, right? It just wouldn't have occurred to you. So then how could it be that he was being led on, right? So the concept of catfishing was not common, at least until the MTV show Catfish blew up. So you really have to understand, like, this is not a concept that was common. And even then, like, anybody who's watched Catfish, it's shocking that the lengths people will go to keep a relationship going. It's not as simple as stealing a picture and creating an identity, right? Like, there's a whole, like, science behind it, and it's so deep. And the one thing that surprised me about watching Catfish were how the motivations differed. Like, yeah, sometimes it is people who are lonely and sad, but other times it's because people are vindictive and petty as hell and they're trying to get revenge. And so the other thing is, like, just the commitment level, you know, from the person catfishing is massive. And again, you have to understand, like, a deep emotional bond had already been created. And when you have that bond with someone, you're kind of scared to lose them. Right? Like, you discussed, you know, your deepest personal secrets. Like, it just doesn't make sense how someone could lead you on to this extent. Like, you really got to understand, like, for those of you who are judging him, it's not easy. Also, what I found interesting about the show Catfish is, like, the expectations, like the entitlement from some of the catfish people. Like, they would just be like, listen, I'm still the same person. And I'm like, no, like, listen, if you lie about what you look like and you lead me on, I'm sorry, I don't have to accept you for who you are. And that's the other thing about that show. It took it to levels that I don't think, like, you would think as an average person, you're like, who would do all this? And so for that being said, what struck out at me during this documentary is the way Naya was recalling events and the way Manti was recalling events. Like, Manti was still quite traumatized. Like, I don't think this was an easy process for him. And I think, you know, he as he was talking about it, like, you could sense he was still like, he still thinks about it. Whereas Naya was just kicking it. She's like, as if he released the voicemails, as if that happened. Like, she's like, I can't believe that shit happened. I was like, bitch, what do you mean? Like, you guys tell me. But every time she said she was like sorry, I just didn't feel it. So I don't know, like, you guys tell me, but I just was not feeling the remorse at all. So as their relationship deepened, so did the effects Naya had on his life. Like, this, she quite literally paralyzed this man. And at some point, he had the opportunity to get drafted into the NFL early, and he turned it down to play his senior year. And this decision to stay his senior year really proves that you are always one decision away from a totally different life, right? Like, had he gone into the NFL early, even if this story came out, it wouldn't have really mattered, you know. And also, the story only blew up during his senior year. So it's crazy how one decision just changes everything. During this time, you know, according to Naya, they were speaking, she was giving him tips, and some of the tips that she was giving was like helping him. And as Naya is speaking, I got quite annoyed because I'm like, I think some part of her took credit for his success, which I didn't really like. And so the last year of Manti's, that senior year, was very intense. And so he became super popular. He was playing, you know, amazing. And so he had less time for Lennay. And Lennay, being Lennay, decided, okay, it's time to kill this off one last time. And I thought that was quite petty, because not only did she kill Lennay off, she killed Lennay off at the same time that his grandmother had died. Now, I don't know, you know, the timeline was quite traumatic for Manti. So Lennay's death triggered the beginning of the end. You know, it was the difference between Manti breaking down or rising back up. And the fact that after Naya killed off Lennay, you know, she kind of wrote him these fake letters before each game as a way to motivate him. And Manti says these letters that were left to him by what he thought was his dead girlfriend really pushed him, really motivated him. And I thought that was pretty manipulative, right? Like, you're kind of tethering yourself onto this man in a way that, you know, now he has no choice but to credit you for everything. You know, it was a way of just kind of keeping him close. So once the story broke out that Manti lost his grandmother and lost his girlfriend in the same sort of time period, he just became the poster child for overcoming all odds, right? He just became the it person. And the atmosphere was that of a Hollywood movie. He was on the cover of major magazines. He was doing interviews. He was about to win the Heisman Trophy. Like, things were just happening that were just like, wow. With every success, Manti gave credit to his family and his dead girlfriend and his dead girlfriend's family. So it was just like, damn. So during this time, you know, Manti being a good guy, like, he was keeping in touch with his family, right? He's like checking in if they're okay, if, you know, is everything fine? And at one point, Naya has the audacity to meet up with him, with this little kid, who he literally kind of coerced into saying, like, I miss Auntie Lennay. And then she gave him a hug. And this whole thing, I just kept thinking, like, the audacity. And the thing for me is, like, okay, if you killed Lennay off, that would have been fine. Like, I could actually buy the whole, okay, I grew an emotional attachment to him, fine. But this is where she lost all sympathy for me. The decision to resurrect Lennay. I think after she met with Manti and she saw him in person, I'm not sure. Like, I would wonder if she was, like, you know, kind of offended that he didn't recognize her, or there, you know, it triggered this obsession again. Like, there is that kind of, like, you know, you don't even know I'm right in front of you type thing. And so this is where I lost all sympathy. And again, I don't like the, you know, when you bring her back, it's like, this guy has been crediting his success to you throughout the year. You know, like, let it go. Let him move on. But the minute you decide to resurrect this person, what you're saying is like, you're nothing without me. In order to convince Manti that Lennay was real, Naya convinced her classmate Diane to take a picture with all the specifications that Manti asked for. So Manti was like, this is BS, like, you're not real, blah, blah, blah. He's like, okay, if this is really you, I need you to, like, you know, hold up a sign, make a, like, he gave a bunch of, like, he gave a bunch of specifications. And so Naya convinced Diane to take this picture under the guise of, you know, somebody needed help or was sick. And so this picture, like, sent him spiraling because he's like, she's alive. And, you know, I have to say, like, my other theory, this is when things just took a turn. Because whenever Manti got bad news, he never broke. You know, like, he always kept going. He got stronger. But I don't know if this annoyed Naya. Like, that's what I'm wondering. I'm like, I just don't think, I think at a certain point it becomes vindictive, where you have to wonder, like, you didn't do this because you care about him. You know, you did this to break him. And so, you know, she picked someone who had a lot of potential. I don't think it's a coincidence, you know, when you think about the fact that Naya came from a lineage of NFL players, and here's Manti, who came from nothing and was able to move up. Like, I wonder if there's some resentment there. Like, I wish Netflix asked more questions. And so, you know, I don't know if it was jealousy, because when you resurrect someone, you know that this is going to break them. You know, like, there's no scenario in which his mind isn't going to just fracture at that point. And so she had all this power over him, and she knew she had this power over him. And this is very intentional, in my opinion. Things just take an even more ridiculous turn when we get to part 2 of this documentary, like, the aftermath. So now Manti is dealing with the fact that his dead girlfriend is alive. He doesn't know what to do with himself. He has a massive game coming up. He has the Heisman. He wants to tell the truth, but he doesn't know how to tell it. That's the thing. He's not a guy who can lie. So keeping this inside was just killing him. And so one day, a group of reporters got an anonymous email. And you guys explain this anonymous email. This email was from Chris, claiming that Lennay is a hoax. And I'm 99% sure that that email was sent from Naya. Like, you're not going to tell me otherwise, because there's really nothing to suggest anyone would have picked up on this story, especially with ESPN and, like, the New York Times and all these people covering it. Like, the email was so sure that this was a hoax and a scam that I'm like, okay, only the scammer would know that. And again, like, as Naya was talking in this documentary, I just got the sense that she couldn't wait to talk. You know, like, she was just really kicking it, in my opinion. So I'm like, you don't have to be an FBI agent to be like, you definitely sent the email. And if she didn't send the email, I don't know. I just don't, like, who else would have sent the email? And so the aftermath, you know, this is the foundation. And as soon as he found out that this girl was alive, it was the end. Like, he broke. And so this email reaches these 2 raggedy reporters, which we'll talk about in a moment. And one of these reporters, they basically gets their spidey senses tingling. They're like, there's something here, you know, like, there's a story here. Like, the email's too specific to ignore. And so when they Googled Lennay, they found that this person literally did not exist outside of being Manti Te'o's girlfriend. And so that was the story. And so it got them thinking, could it be that they staged this whole thing to get the Heisman Trophy? Could it be like this is an elaborate scheme to make Notre Dame, you know, great again? Like, you know, they were really going in. And according to these raggedy DeadSpin reporters, first of all, I didn't believe anything coming out of their mouth. Their motivation was to embarrass these massive publications, right? Like, how could it be that ESPN and the New York Times, like, they didn't do their due diligence? I mean, first of all, I will agree, like, these massive publications should have done more, right? Like, some of the publications, you know, published that the grandma died before Lennay. Some said Lennay died after the grandma. Like, there was no consistency. Also, these DeadSpin reporters, they did call every funeral home. They called Stanford. Like, they really tried to verify if this person existed. There's only one thing I couldn't really piece together, was this photo. So these journalists, again, I will give them credit. They did do a lot of work. Like, they reverse image searched every photo. They checked on every single person on her friend list. And they got to the point where they actually figured out, like, it was Diana. you know, like Ronaya and Diana, like the identity of these people. For that, I'll give them credit. However, you have to remember, like, DeadSpin was a small publication, and this was a mainstream story. So their decision to publish the story, I think, had to do with, like, getting clicks. And I don't really buy the whole, like, they kept saying throughout the documentary, like, I can't believe the NFL would be so homophobic and this, you know, young man's life would be potentially ruined. I'm like, you didn't care. You know, like, at the end of the day, like, if you wanted to make a story about catfishing, that's the thing, the headline said hoax. When you use the word hoax, you're implying that this is a scam, right? So everything these reporters did, it was to get into the mainstream, right? It made them famous, it got them clicks, and that was their motivation. I wish they just admitted to that instead of trying to act like there was some sort of bigger, like, picture. Because again, there's a lot of ways you could have framed the story. You could have framed it as the dangers of catfishing. You could have given Manti a chance to explain. You could have talked to Ronaya. Like, there's a lot you could have done to, like, give that story, like, redirect the conversation. Instead, you chose a headline and you wrote it in a way that you knew would just blow up. At this point in time, while these DeadSpin reporters are working at this, Manti is coping with the fact that this girl he thought was dead is not dead. He's about to play in a championship game. Poor guy is taking interviews, you know, for the Heisman Trophy. Thank God he didn't win the Heisman, you know. And he's sinking. He's quite literally sinking deeper and deeper into depression. And he doesn't know how to break the news, right? It's like just sitting inside him. And finally he breaks. He tells his family. He tells the people at Notre Dame. He tells an uncle, like a family lawyer, who basically told him, listen, you're being catfished. And that was the first time they heard the term catfish. And what's sad is, like, immediately everybody blamed Manti, right? Especially his dad. He was just like, yo, how could my son not know? He's the oldest. And I understand that frustration, right? Because it's like, how could you be led on? And again, for those of you who don't really sympathize, you have to understand this is a different time. And when you develop it's so hard to develop an emotional bond with people that you just can't imagine having that connection with someone and then breaking it. It just doesn't make sense because that connection is so hard to make in the first place. And so what was supposed to be a story about poor journalism, apparently, you know, just turned into like a tabloid sensation. It became a circus. It became chaos. The narrative, of course, was not about catfishing. It was about, like, how can we make sure that Manti is not gay so that we don't draft him into the NFL? And that's a whole other documentary about the sheer homophobia of the NFL. That's a whole other, you know, conversation. And the fact that this could have killed him, for me, was crazy because he did nothing wrong. At the end of the day, like, the only thing he's guilty of was being naive and a kid. But the fact that, like, they were actively trying to figure out if the image of this kid was real, like, they were trying to say, is this really... They were essentially questioning his manhood, you know? And, like, would it have been better if the catfish was female? You know, would it have been better if... Because that was the whole story, right? Like, he was catfished by a man, like... Who would fall for this unless he really wanted to? Like, all these just really, really, like, character assassinations on this man. Comments were merciless. The public was merciless. You know, all these questions, like, was he complicit? How is it possible he never met her? And just when you thought this documentary couldn't get any crazier, they invited Dr. Phil. And Dr. Phil was not having it. Like, they looked like he barely agreed to be in this documentary. And he just sat down and he was like, listen, you can't believe anything this person is saying. Like, that was his vibe years later. And at some point, like, they show us footage of this exclusive interview with Naya, right? Who at the time is Ronaya. And, you know, during this time, again, everything was very tabloid. Like, everybody wanted to get the exclusive. This was like the National Enquirer era. Like, y'all have to understand, like, the press was different. We just wanted the tea. We don't care about the truth, right? We just want to hear crazy so we can be entertained. And so Dr. Phil, being Dr. Phil, you know, during this interview was like, do the voice. Do the voice so everyone can see how terrible you are. Like, do the voice so, like, people can understand how deep this goes. And at first I was like, all right, Dr. Phil, like, I'm not a fan of Dr. Phil, but I don't know. I was kind of like, yeah. And so Dr. Phil described him as like a method actor, right? He goes into this room and Naya was complaining that he released the voice notes. I was like, if you don't get out of here. And the voice was convincing. Again, anyone who's seen the show Catfish, like, you know. And I'm sorry, like, if you've seen the show Catfish, especially when it first came out, there's no way you could be watching that and not shocked. People were changing their voices. People were lying about, like, they were just fabricating things that you're just like, why would you fabricate that? Oh, his family was talking about the voices, right? That was the issue, these voice notes. And the press kind of got on that. They're like, this doesn't sound like a girl. Like, I don't know, maybe we need to rethink this. Maybe he was catfished. And these voice notes are interesting because his family was talking, like his mom and dad were like, yeah, we talked to a man, a woman, like, and you could literally hear them being like passing the phone to someone. And so, y'all, like, this is deep. Like, why would you think there wasn't one person maybe, but like multiple characters? No, you wouldn't think anything of it. So poor Manti, like, he barely got drafted. He went to San Diego, and even San Diego didn't want him, right? This whole, I actually, like, wasn't familiar with the story. So there was a moment where I'm like, is he gonna get drafted? And so even the city that he's drafted in is making fun of him. And this is such a stark contrast to when he went to Notre Dame, where everyone was super excited to see him and everybody was super happy that he was there. And now San Diego, like, they're almost embarrassed that he's there, right? Like, fans are taking pictures with him to troll him, right? Like this imaginary girlfriend. SNL, that SNL skit, I mean, people were just roasting him. And so when he went into the NFL, things got worse because he had this crippling anxiety for 3 years. Right? He lost his confidence, and I think for someone who puts their faith in God, it's quite difficult because you're just like, how could you do this to me? You know, I think it's one thing to forgive the person who did it, but it's hard because you feel stupid. You're like, how could I have fallen for this? You know, like, how could I have been so naive? How could I have been? And it shakes your faith because, you know, you kind of go into the world thinking it's like a friendly universe, and then, you know, it does alter your thoughts. You're like, damn, like, this universe isn't as friendly as I thought it was. And so he started seeing a therapist, and, you know, the therapist, he was able to kind of unpack some things, especially with, you know, just not being too hard on himself. I think people who excel like that and are very, you know, they work really hard, they're the hardest on themselves. And you have to realize you're a human being, and it doesn't matter if, like, it doesn't matter what you do. Like, we're all vulnerable to the same BS at the end of the day. Like, no one is immune to anything. And so he's still struggling with it. Like, I could see when he was talking, like, he was just not happy bringing this up. And so what was the point of this documentary? You know, like, I felt like the effects are unintentional. Like, the way this documentary was shot was just one in which it's just like, you're entertained, but you're like, what? Like, you're just gonna let them talk like this? Like, you're just gonna let Naya here talk? Like, you're not gonna intervene and ask her the hard questions? Like, I just think they could have done more. I did sympathize with Naya in terms of, like, finding yourself and connecting with others, and, you know, it seems like she found a place where she feels welcomed and she feels, you know, like, at home. But at the same time, I'm thinking about Manti, where it's like, this literally crippled this man, right? Like, any attempts for him to find himself, like, it took him double the time, you know, and he still looks like he's struggling with it. So the other thing I will say about that is, when you put your faith in God, I imagine it's quite hard to open up to people ever again. You know, at the end, he says he'll take the memes, he'll take the jokes if it just inspires one person. And I think that's wonderfully said, right? It just kind of reminds you that, you know, at the end of the day, like, it shouldn't close off your heart. And at one point during the documentary, his friend said, you know, like, with all the voices that Naya was giving, you know, she should be in Disney. And I thought that was wonderfully said, because at the end of the day, like, Manti was never lying about anything. You know what I mean? Like, he was never censoring himself. He was just putting his heart out there, and, you know, unfortunately, he was manipulated and tricked. So it's just a nice reminder that if something bad does happen to you, or if someone does take advantage, it shouldn't close you off. You know, like, you should still be the person that you are, and good things will happen regardless. So he got drafted, and, you know, it worked out, but it is, like, it is tough when you have that type of personality, right? So good on him. You know, it's humbling for the rest of us, right? You guys let me know what you think. This documentary was wild. Again, now we have such a broad, there's so much literature on catfishing that, right? But back then, like, the internet was for meeting people. You know, it wasn't for information, right? Like, you were just kind of trying to connect, and that's it. So you guys let me know what you think, and until next time. Where are you?